Thank you for being here. I think we have a small group today, which I kind of expected, and that's absolutely fine. Um, and the focus, I'm going to do two different parts to this tonight, just to make it a little bit more dynamic and fun. The focus is on writing your life story or helping someone else to write their life story, and what that means, and all the tools that are available to you to do it. Since that is falls very close to the category of a memoir, I thought it might be fun to start with what is a memoir and a little bit about the history of the memoir and the rise of the memoir, because it's really interesting how, if we go to bookstores today, we see there's shelves and shelves full of memoirs. Perhaps you have a favorite one that you've read lately, that memoir either of someone famous or not famous. And you can add those to the chat if you wanted to recommend a good memoir. So I'm going to go ahead and share a screen and tell you a little bit about what I've learned about the rise of the memoir. And then in the second half of the presentation, I want to get in the nitty gritty. I want to hear if you guys have any projects that you're working on, or what has brought you here, what's your interest, and so that I can answer specific questions, and as well as just tell you everything I know. Not everything. Who knows everything? All right, here we go. All right, so sharing. Hopefully my toggling won't be too slow as I share. All right, in terms of the memoir, one of the first questions I am always getting about memoir is, what's the difference between an autobiography and a memoir? And so I'm going to add in two other genres here, which is the biography, much easier to differentiate, and you probably already know the difference, and what I call personal history. All right, so we have the biography. Again, I started with this because it's simple. The life history of an individual written by someone else about that person, generally in third person, he, she, they, and includes key moments in their lives that make them who they are. And a lot of times they're success stories, and you can see there's pictures of some very well-known and best-selling biographies here, and there's a lot of those. Okay, an autobiography generally tells the story of an author's life chronologically, shares the facts of their lives, but in their own words. It is in first person, I, me, and the purpose is generally to share the life experiences and achievements of the author. And it is because of that, it is almost always by some sort of well-known figure, somebody who you want to know about, what happened, who they are and what happened to them. Not always, though. Then we have the memoir. Okay, memoirs dive deep in the author's most intimate memories, exploring emotional truths and the way these make them feel. It is usually in service of a larger theme or idea. It doesn't have to be in chronological order. It may focus on one particular part or aspect of their life. It is almost always written in first person, I and me, and it can be written by someone famous or people you've never even heard of before. So autobiographies and memoirs, this kind of does a good job, I think, comparing the two. So an autobiography basically covers an author's entire life, but not always. A memoir usually covers only part of an author's life. Autobiographies are usually about famous and important people, and we read about them to learn about the author. Memoirs can be about anybody, and we read them because of the subject, the theme, the style, because there's something in there that we want to know about or experience with them. Autobiographies are usually written in chronological order. Memoirs don't have to be. They can move back and forth in time. Autobiographies place greater emphasis on facts and histories generally, whereas memoirs place greater emphasis on emotional experience and interiority. But do the two overlap? Absolutely. Some of our best autobiographies have a lot of reflection in them, and we have an emotional connection to the authors as they're telling us about their lives and telling us the stories of their lives. Memoirs also can be chronological, in chronological order, and it can cover a lot of the life story. And I would say both of them can, when they're really, really intriguing, often use really great narrative techniques, the techniques of any great fictional story. And here's a little bit more about memoirs that I think makes them a very, very special genre. A good memoir usually grabs your heart and never lets go. Like all great books, it's a ticket to someplace new. Whereas an autobiography is more about learning about that particular person. When you read a memoir, you're learning about that person, but you're learning about their emotional truths, and in it, you tend to empathize and go there with them, and maybe think about what those things mean to you in your own life. Memoirs involve reflection, they establish an emotional connection, and they can feel really intimate. Authors like Tobias Wolff, Mary Karr, and Cheryl Strayed have inserted the memoir into the front and center of literary conversations. If any of you belong to our reading group, you probably read memoirs in your group and talked about them, and maybe had some of your best discussions about them, because they tend to be very intriguing. These same authors, they merge humor, self-critical honesty, and epiphany into books. And they're page turners in that way. They can change minds and hearts, and more importantly, perspectives about the world we inhabit, past and present. Memoir is the gritty stuff. It's the little shards that don't always fit together perfectly because life doesn't. And they don't always tie up the loose ends. And it doesn't always glide along a plot arc like a work of fiction, even though, like I said, it still incorporates some excellent uses of narrative technique. But it's not, it doesn't follow that arc always. It is not always profound. It is not always brilliant. It's not always tragic. And it may be as close to real life as you can possibly get in a paperback because of that. Some of the most common topics, you see these days are, you see a lot of recovery. You see people finding love. You see people finding themselves. Could be about what it was like to be a president, or what it was like to be an astronaut. It could be a moment in their life that changed them forever, or how to deal with having a certain illness or disease, or having someone they love have an illness or disease. It's all those incidences, those that are common to the human experience. Memoirs allow us to immerse ourselves in a new perspective that really exists or existed, and in the same world we all inhabit. So we help us to understand and empathize, and to truly walk into somebody else's shoes. And like I said, personal histories. Okay, so this is personal history. So I haven't really introduced myself that much, other than what Darren said. I am a professional author, and along with titles under my own pen name, I also help people to write their memoirs, biographies, personal histories, organizational histories. And I've been doing that since 2006. I've written a lot of books, or edited the books, helped however, and published them as well. And so helped in any way I can. So I've done the entire process many, many times. And personal histories can be very, very different depending on who you are. Every time I do it, I think I've done like 45 books at this point. Every time you do it, it's customized, it's different, because you're talking about a different human being, a different narrator. But I would say my favorite personal histories, they combine the elements of both autobiography and memoir, in that they're usually chronological and in first person. However, they do have more emotional truth and reflection. And those are, I think, really important to making a personal history more relevant to the readers. And who the readers are, it could be published for the public, but it could also be privately published. So the main readers might just be family and friends. It might be future generations. And, one of the goals then is to connect with them, for them to feel like they belong to this family. the it also, the events are show how the author became who he, she, or they are, and it's a legacy. And so they're very powerful, and they're about everybody. Everybody does have a story to tell. Okay, so this is just a little history lesson here, but a lot of fun. The memoir is hugely popular. We talked, as I said at the beginning, right now, but it wasn't always. So I did some historical research, and it was fascinating. You do have something sort of like a memoir back, almost 2,000 years ago. There were some in ancient China, just a few that we know of now. Most of them are probably lost if there were other types of writing like that. One of the ones that we know about was Confessions by St. Augustine, written in Latin around 400 AD. In it, he outlines his sinful youth and his conversion to Christianity. He makes this plea, amongst others: grant me chastity and continence, but not yet. Which I think is a great treatise on, say, maybe the early 20s, in your experience, especially at least at that time. Okay, then what's considered one of the earliest surviving autobiographies or memoirs in English was actually written in the Renaissance period. It was by a woman, Marjorie Kemp. I'm sorry, I'm moving you guys around. She was a wife, a mother, a businesswoman, a pilgrim, a visionary. And she recounts in this book vivid and unembarrassed details about the madness following the birth of her 14 children, the failure of her brewery business, her dramatic call to the spiritual life, her visions and uncontrollable tears, the struggle to convert her husband to avowed chastity. That would be interesting to read about. And her pilgrimages to Europe and the Holy Land. If you look at the subject matters, you could probably find memoirs today that are about some of these things, but only in contemporary ways. And this is a line from her book: "You can boldly take me in the arms of your soul and kiss my mouth, my head, and my feet as sweetly as you want." So pretty intriguing for the times. All right, then we go on to the 15th and early 16th century. The country in Europe, at least, that took hold of the memoir the most was France. Kind of makes sense. And so you had one, here's an example, which was by Philippe de Comines, which he's talking about himself in the court of Louis the 11th. Then into the 17th and 18th century, the French continued to excel at this genre and continued to write about Louis. But we also had soldier memoirs come into some popularity at that time. At that time, it would have been the English Civil Wars of the 17th century. And some of the soldiers started writing about their experiences in war. Into the 18th and early 19th century, we had memoirs and biographies more and more now by famous people because fame was starting to become a thing. We had newspapers and print, and just the beginning of our contemporary media was starting, especially in the 19th century with the printing press. So we had Berlioz, the musician, talking about his musical life. Casanova, who was not as famous, talking about being a rake. So really spicy stuff. Then you had Rousseau's Confessions, which is so well known and studied to this day because he wrote his autobiography very much like a memoir with a lot of personal feelings. Then in this country, this was a book that really stands out as a model for a lot of people at the time of what you could do writing about your own experiences, was Walden by Henry David Thoreau. Definitely memoir-like. So you can see here, this gives you a sense of autobiographies, some of which are like memoirs, and the rise of the popularity. So part of this, of course, had to do with there was more and more books being published because it was easier to print them. But in terms of what was available in the genre, autobiographies became much more popular. If you think about it, there was just a little bit more tendency to want to know about other people. There was also a tendency to want to know a little bit more about ourselves. Um, but still, the majority of biographies and autobiographies during that time were clergy and religious, followed by military, and followed by frontier life and writers and um, and criminal and the deviants. That was a bigger category than military. We already people wanted to read about criminals and criminal minds. Then in the 20th century, we have Freud. And I'm using Freud to represent many other many other invent early under kind of say scientists in neurology and in psychology and psycho and other kinds of psychology. So Freud had an emphasis on self-revelation, and increased understanding of human psychology and self-awareness became part of the human psyche. Just started to. There was suddenly, oops, sorry, the typo. There was suddenly vocabulary to articulate processes of the human brain that we never knew before. A few, and of course, more and more as the century continued, we started to become aware of an internal life, and also a process of personal change and growth was possible with psychotherapy and other techniques. And that was new. And that changed a ton of things. That changed everything. We also had individualism. By the Roaring 20s, the clergy and criminal bookshelf had dropped to less than 20% of all autobiographies. And there was a spike in celebrities and entertainers. Again, we had the rise of the media. We have movies. We have radio all coming into existence. In the 1940s, absolutely entertainers were that was the most popular genre. And then we started to see some memoirs appearing during that span. Then we get to our late 20th century, and we have the civil rights and the huge rise of the media. We have television and advertising and marketing and newspapers, and farther communication. We were all the world was becoming a smaller place, and so that we started to see more and more where we wanted to know about other people and places. And then this was also a huge revelation. 1976, we had Roots by Alex Haley, which got people interested in their own genealogy. That has been also a huge influence from then on. It was in the 1990s, however, that the memoir had its tipping point. Because in the 1990s, we had several different things going on at once. We had the beginning of the internet. So, and with Facebook, blogs, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, we have people sharing their personal stories all the time, but rarely with raw honesty. We had different politics at the time. We were, where we didn't trust it as much. We had reality TV and these sensationalized shows. I think we were looking for something more real. We also had desktop publishing, is what it was called in the 90s, which were design tools that you could have in your own home. That was absolutely new, to have computers where you could write your own books. You could put them into book form. We also had the advent of digital printing and not just offset. So book printing got a lot easier, and people began to be able to self-publish or independently publish, as well as go to large publishing houses. And the memoirs became a literary phenomenon. Angela's Ashes and the Liars Club were among the ones that really started the trend. These are other things that I find that are influences. We have, with our family structure, there's a separation of the elderly. And that means there's wisdom lost, at least in this country. And this happened more and more around the world too. There was a new sensibility that's occurred in the last 20 years, 30 years about sharing your story and the value of it. And that is not just laying out your dirty laundry. A lot of people in previous generations, especially women, were taught, you don't share your story, you don't talk about yourself. That is selfish. That is, it's about others. And so, but now we understand that telling your story is not necessarily ego driven. It's it's an act of sharing if you're going to be honest, because when you're really honest about it, it can be really hard. So in an age of superficiality and contrivance, we're seeking truth. We have a greater need, I think, for personal connection than ever before, as we have this huge population of people, and we try to figure out where we fit in and who we fit in with. And community centers, like schools used to be community centers. Everybody would gather, but we have these larger communities now, and it's not necessarily the case as much anymore. There's a shared experience of overcoming hardships that we are all looking for, helping each other in a society that does not monetarily value service to others. The examined life settles the mind and makes us sure of things. And we are all much more aware of an internal life than we used to be. And memoirs tend to lessen the shame by making public what was private. And now we're talking about things that we never talked before. Things like, well, for women, menopause and miscarriages and postpartum depression, for anger management, and these things, and alcoholism and drug and abuse, and both as a victim and as the perpetrator. And we're talking about these things now, these very uncomfortable things that we didn't talk about before. And people, I think, are relieved because it's a shared humanity. So this is what it looks like now. Thousands of memoirs are pouring off the shelves to this day. In the category of personal memoirs, childhood memoirs, and parental memoirs, it increased over 400% between 2004 and 2008. In 2007, more memoirs were accepted by publishers than debut novels. Currently, the memoir is the top nonfiction genre sold in the US and the UK. 31% of Americans said biographies and memoir was their preferred type of book. And in 2019, this book, the sales of memoirs in the UK, surged 42% to 2.5 million, according to the Nielsen Book Research. That's just to give you an idea. I think I already mentioned all this stuff. So that's a little something about that. So before I go on to the second part, which is really talking more about your personal histories and what goes into it and how you can write one yourself and how you can manage the writing of one. Are there any questions about the memoir, or any memoirs, that really stand out for you that you just love to share with other people here?
Was Joy Luck Club a memoir by Amy Tan? Does that fall under memoir? That was huge.
Yes, I believe it does. It's not fiction, right? I think that was on my list. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think I had that down as one of my examples in here.
I believe it may have been fiction, but I'm
Was that
not.
one fiction?
I'm pretty sure that it is fiction.
She's written both, but Joy
That's-
Luck Club might be fiction.
I'll look it up for you right now.
Oh, thank you.
I'll get back to you shortly.
It's listed as a novel. I'm trying to remember what her fiction book or her nonfic is, because
Yeah.
let me find that.
Thank you.
I guess that leads to my question, the fine line between creative nonfiction, memoir, and outright nonfiction.
Yes, and that's a good, very, very good distinction, because in memoir, in memoir, there's a focus more on telling your emotional truth, and when you tell your emotional truth, there can be you can fill in gaps to your memories, and I think that is acceptable. You can't make up. You can't say you've been an astronaut if you're not an astronaut. But if you're trying to describe a scene, oh gosh, where you're having a huge argument with, you're having a huge argument with your husband, and it ends up in divorce, and your memoir is about divorce, and then getting on your feet again. There could be liberties taken in filling in the dialogue from what you remember, from your emotional memory, filling in the colors of the kitchen and the details, because you need to add, because you have to have some narrative, some of those narrative sensory details and things that draw your reader in. So that is when it becomes creative nonfiction, creative nonfiction is a huge, I think memoir falls into it. It's a much larger category that can also include a treatise on something. If you just wanted to talk about books in a funny way, or elves, David Sedaris works, for example, that some of his are memoir and about him, but some of them are definitely not, right? Does that help to?
It does. Does it depend on the audience that you're writing for too?
What?
Well, do you get more mainstream acceptance if you're doing a creative nonfiction piece than an outright memoir? Do you have to have some kind of a draw? You be a celebrity or?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't think so for either of those. Autobiographies, it helps to be famous. But I think for the other two genres, for any kind of creative nonfiction or for memoir, it just has to be something, it has to have either be a topic or an experience that draws people in, that people truly that want to experience or know about, or learn about. And in terms of writing from a writer's point of view, I think you write first what you need to write, and then you see where it falls into a genre. And of course, so much of writing is rewriting, that if you need to clean up something to make it fall more neatly into a genre, that's maybe
that's good advice. Just get it all out and then
get it all out
it later.
Yeah, and the second half of this is all about that. It's about getting started, ways to get started, ways to keep going, and strategies you can use. So this is creating your story, and you just answered my question. So like we were talking about autobiography versus memoir. If I was to just give you this list of stuff I've done, that's autobiographical stuff. But if I was to tell you more about the picture of me, that's me as a little girl right there. That would be more memoir writing, because that's a significant event. And I'll come back to that later, because I'd actually rather talk about you first. I really believe this, that there never yet was an uninteresting life, that such a thing is an impossibility. Inside the dullest exterior, there's a drama, a comedy, and a tragedy. We all have stories, because we all have an arc of development as human beings. And we all have characters and influences and made choices. And if you think about a lot of, even in a fictional story arc, it's all about choices sometimes. And you have all these moments. All right, so I have several pages here about getting started. Sounds like some of you already have, but I'm going to go, so I'll go through them, and maybe some of them will be helpful. There is no wrong way to get started, basically. You can outline things. It depends who you are. I mean, a lot of writers say, oh, there's two kinds, those that outline everything first and then start, and others that just jump in with 2 feet. I do both, and it depends on what I'm writing. And I think most often I jump in and then I outline if I get stuck. But you have to do what's right for you. If you think about how you organize your closet, it's probably different than other people organize their closet. Those things are very personal. There are things that work, right? There's tools to use. Writing is a craft. But what you choose, your choices are up to you, and how you organize it's totally up to you. One great way, that simple way, is phases of life, if you're looking for a way to organize it. But you don't have to. It could be vignettes. It could just be moments. There's a term, what's it called? Called iconic memories. If you've heard it, it's a psychological term. And sometimes you'll have one moment that happened in your life, one event, and it symbolizes a lot of other events, or a feeling, or an occurrence in your household. I remember, for example, this is a very personal one, but it's a good example, so I'll share it. is that I had pressure growing up to always be cheerful, friendly, smiley. But this is real. This is real. But my parents didn't. They're lovely people, but they didn't know how to deal with it emotionally. They didn't know how to deal with anything else. And so one iconic memory for me was, I was in a bad mood, and I think I expressed it somehow, whatever. And my mother was in the hallway, and she just turned around and walked away. And for me, that's an iconic. I know that sounds sad, doesn't it? But it's an iconic memory that symbolizes this conflict. That is something that I write about in my memoir writing because it's powerful and for me. And so I have to assume it's powerful for others, and they've experienced something like it, or if they haven't, that it's worthwhile to experience it with me as a human experience. You can use prompts. A lot of you sound like you've used prompts. There's some places to get them. I have some on my website, Stories to Last. I'm trying to add more. StoryCorps, they have prompts on their website. If you're not familiar with StoryCorps, wonderful organization that helps mostly with oral histories. Storyworth.com is a paid service, and they're all about prompts. And you can do a Google search to find more. You can take a class, like a lot of you have. You can find one writing partner, a friend or relative or writing group, and you can handwrite it on yellow pad. You can put it in a journal. You can type it up on a computer, however it works. I used to do all my writing longhand in journals, and now life is different, and so I keep ongoing documents in my computers or one folder where I just throw in stuff that comes to me. And then I look at it every once in a while going, holy cow, there's a lot of here to use. And some of the pages are one line that just came to me, and some are fully developed. All right. Is it hard to write, or is your time limited, or you're sitting too much? I use notes on my cell phone a lot whenever I think of something. And I probably shouldn't admit this because it's while I'm driving. I don't write while I'm driving, but I have I have voice control. So if I come up with something while I'm driving, which is a time that I often do, I'll say, "Hey Siri," and I don't want that to activate my phone. I say, "Hey Siri," and I'll dictate some ideas onto my notes, which I can do safely. And then I have them. There's really weird words and it's not spelled right, but it's something that I can use later. Chrome Google Docs has voice typing. So if it's easier for you to say your story out loud, either just to yourself or pretend you're saying it to someone else, that's a great way to do it. I actually, over half of the people I work with when I'm helping people to save their stories, they've written nothing, and I just do personal interviews with them, and then they have them transcribed. And from those, we turn them into stories. We edit them into stories on the page. What I like about that is that it already has the authentic voice in it, because all of us have certain phrases we use or a syntax that we use that's familiar to us. And if you think about even fiction that you've read that's in first person, that might have a character that's, that's really intriguing. Sometimes then, the unreliable narrator, they have a voice, they have a real voice. And so I think that makes a difference. You don't want to get rid of that. That makes it more of a 16th century portrait, which, that's fine too. People do that. And, but I like the authentic voice. The disadvantage of doing it from interviews is that sometimes we talk a lot differently than we want to sound on paper. So it can take a lot of revision, a lot of editing, but it's a fascinating exercise. There's lots of free audio recording apps on the smartphone. I really like this one, which I think I have the name of on another page, but there's tons of them. So if you're out for walks, that's a great time to think. I have a friend who's, we challenge each other to write our memoirs, and she does a lot of hers while she's walking, and she talks into a recorder and then has it transcribed. You can also Zoom and record yourself. And it's a great way to get your story down. And so even if you never finished it, you can hand it off to somebody else. Where do you begin? That was a question you had asked. You can start with the beginning of your life and your birth. You can start with your ancestry. You can start with, like I said, an iconic story, something that really stands out for you. And there's going to be a whole bunch of those. You can start with a theme. One book I helped work on, she was great. It was a story for her grandkids, but she needed to make it thematic. That was what drove her. And so for hers, it was about, she's a professor, and it was about womanhood. It was about sexuality even, but also about earning respect as a woman in her career too. So hers was thematic. You could start in the middle. You start with a relationship. It's very interesting talking to different people who write their stories. Some people think in a very linear way. This happened, then this happened, then this happened, but others don't. And that's okay. I've talked to a lot of people that the way that their thoughts are organized is kind of I call a cluster around a person. And then there's all these experiences they've had with that person from birth to death, or it could be around a certain theme, or it could be around some other incidences. Songs are great things to help your memories flow. Photos, as was suggested, are a great way to recollect things. You can collect questions from family members as well. It sounds like a lot of you have seen prompts, and you'll get a copy of this later. So here are just some examples of different prompts. And some can be very simple, just like who is your first boyfriend or girlfriend. And some can be much more, intriguing, like, well, what is one of the most difficult things you've ever done? And what was the outcome? So you can start with either kind of prompt. One thing to think about, and somebody asked about publishing, so I'll get into that, is like how to share your stories with a wider audience.
Slide back for a second.
Oh, sure.
I'll take a picture of it.
Oh, good. You got it.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. One thing to think about is if you're actually going to turn into a book. I mean, if you're just writing, you don't even need to worry about this yet. This is a little farther down the process, but if you want to make it a book, you might want to think, who is your audience? Is it just family and friends or the general public? That's more for revision. Do you envision a book with pictures? It could also be a video or a podcast. It doesn't even have to be a book if you're going to save your story these days. There's a ton of content in our world still. Like I was just talking to a friend of mine. We were walking this morning, and she used to write for a local magazine for Oakland Magazine, and it went belly up during COVID, and she's really missing doing some journalism. And so we were talking about that. There's tons of content out there to write these days, but it's a different kind of content than it used to be, and a lot of it's very visual. A lot of it's very marketing oriented. So it's harder to find journalistic outlets, but they're out there too. And I think there'll be more of that because we're all craving that. But what appeals to you most, and how much do you want to do or can you do versus investing in getting help? That sort of thing is something to think about. But Annie Lamott, she has chapter 3 of her book, Bird by Bird, is what I use. To get me through any writer's block. It takes care. It's a writer blockbuster immediately, and it's this. If you don't mind my language, it's called shitty first draft, and that to me that is the goal of any writing when you first sit down to do it. Because if you're trying to write a masterpiece, it probably isn't going to happen. Not the first time around. First of all, writers really don't determine if something is a masterpiece. That's determined by readers. But when you're taking a piece of writing and really developing it, that happens in revision. So first, all good writing begins with terrible first efforts. You need to start somewhere. Start by getting anything down on paper. And what Annie Lamott has learned to do when she sits down is to work on a shitty first draft. and to quiet the voices in her head. Again, that's all it's about, just getting something on paper. And if she can get something really horrible on paper, that's a victory. So if you think of it that way, you cannot fail. And that's, I mean, really, that's a great way to start. Yeah, this is another way to say it, is you get the monkeys off your shoulder. You don't want to worry about about other people later. That's when you're editing. In mid-flow, you need the illusion of privacy, not to be anticipating anybody's reactions, which are unpredictable anyway. There are how-to books out there that you can use. It's so funny. I've bought lots of different memoir books over time just to refer to, and I find some incredibly helpful, some not. And there's a lot of the same kinds of advice in them, but they can be helpful if you're stuck. This is more about how to keep going. And now, I don't think anybody really mentioned this part, but so I can skip it if you want. But if anybody is interested, if they're trying to work with somebody else, I think there was one person who said they're working with their 95 and 97-year-old parents, and they're right. Yes, and you want to get those stories out to somewhere else. So I'll talk about how to get them out to somewhere else. That was your main question. But if you I can't see the chat for you to answer how far you are in it. Sounds like you've written the stories. But this is some advice I would have, suggestions if you're interviewing somebody else. The best interviews that I've found combine preparation and having a basic outline with organic. Just let them talk. But at some point, you got to get to the next thing. And it's a really, because it really takes active listening. That's like the main part. And if you're active listening, you're going to go in different directions than you expected to, but that's when you're going to get the really juicy stuff. I remember I was interviewing this gentleman who grew up in the South Pittsburgh, I think it was. It was kind of hilly. He was very poor. And he was approaching 90 when I talked to him. And he was just talking about something, and I asked him a few questions. He talked about something else, and all of a sudden he was telling me this story about how, they were so poor and they lived up in these hills. There was nothing paved. The sidewalks were wood slats, and they played in empty lots that were dirt. The streets were all dirt and gravel. And his father was sick. His father's health got better, and they finally were able to move down into town. And when they did, they moved into a new apartment that had paved sidewalks and a paved street. And he was moving in, and he saw some other kids, and one of them threw him a ball, like a rubber ball, and he bounced it. He was 13 years old, and it was the first time he had bounced a ball. And I thought that was really significant. He wouldn't have told me that story otherwise. And he didn't know it was significant. I was like, God, that's awesome. Your grandkids are going to learn so much from that. All right. This is
Linda, I just wanted to say that the one question before, which I think you were answering well here, was someone really wanted to draw out stories from different family members, and they were just asking the best way to get them to submit it. But I think what I'm hearing you say is that really sitting and talking with them, recording those when you can, is going to be one of the best ways you're going to get those stories. And then you as the writer have the opportunity to compose that and then to create something that can be shared with the other family.
Yes, and if it in person is great, it's really intimate. And I used to have all this fancy recording equipment, and now I just use my phone. The recording apps are so good, and the sound is so good on my phone. It's better than anything else I've used. And I think I have tools in here as we go on for transcription, really inexpensive transcription online, which became very competitive during COVID with Zoom. You can also record during Zoom, and I started doing Zoom interviews, and you can actually have pretty intimate conversations in Zoom because you can see each other's faces, But also if they are interested in writing, you're trying to get something more out of them in writing, you might want to give them prompts. And I mentioned if you're not sure what prompts, you can give them yourself, but I think I mentioned, what's it called, storyworth.com. It's, like I said, it's a paid service, but what they do, it's great. And they offer If you buy their package, they send a prompt every week for 52 weeks to somebody in your life. And you can create your own or choose from what they have. And they have a place for you to write it down. You can upload pictures to go with it. And at the end, they give you a process where they can turn it into a book for you. So that's another way to do it too. Oh, here's those transcriptions I was talking about. So I'll leave this up for a moment in case you want to take a picture. These are all ones you can hire a transcriber. I've worked with someone for a long time because I know her and she helps me to organize it when she transcribes. But there's lots of tools for it too. Darren, I saw you come up. Was there another question that was related?
Nope, it's all good. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and when people are, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of drawing out stories from people from generations before me, before us, many of them were taught to not talk about themselves. And also the older generations didn't necessarily have as much vocabulary for their emotional lives. They didn't have maybe the sense or the luxury, however you look at it, of having a reflective life. So asking questions and allowing them to think about it and asking why, or and what did that mean to you? What did that feel? That might help. And you may not get it out of them. I've worked with people that I would say, how did that make you feel? But it was really all about the action for them, all about the action. But we were able to pull out some, like, what it meant to them and what they'd like to pass down to other generations and things like that. Then it was able to get, some ethical stuff, talking that sort of meaningful stuff that was related to the stories. In the content, it's like, think about whether it's of somebody else or it's your story, what is important to you and what is your focus? Are you trying to tell a full life story? Are you trying to tell about your ancestors? And we'll get into genealogy, which is a whole nother thing. Is it a thematic life? This was suggested to me. Somebody could try to do this. It's really hard. I don't think I can do it. Is to try to summarize their life in 2 or 3 sentences and see what happens. Here you see a couple examples. You could just focus on one phase of life or several. You could just focus on the ethics. And sometimes this is called an ethical will, where you use the stories of your life to pass down your values. And so you start with the values, and then you're looking for examples of how you came to really have those ethics. Travels, people tell travel stories a lot, and they can be travel stories. You want something that happened that's meaningful generally. Otherwise, it's a little bit harder to make it meaningful. But there's tons of, that's a whole genre, is nonfiction, creative nonfiction with travels. And there's some amazing writers out there. I wanted to call him Boy George, but I don't know, Darren, do you remember the George, something George? He's a wonderful travel writer. I can't remember his name, I'm sorry, I'm terrible with names. And we talked about this, some of this is redundant, but there's life-changing moments, pictures of daily living. Don't underestimate the picture of daily living. That's fascinating if you think about it. All of us, even if you're, in your 30s or 40s, we're all old enough that we've all been a part of history. And when I was a kid, video, we went to the arcade, and then they had home arcades. That was huge, right? That came into existence. The cell phone was invented. I mean, you could think about your pre-cell phone days and think about if you're telling that story to someone who's only lived in a world with cell phones. That's significant. Historical events become really memorable, really, really significant with your perspective because they're personal. And there's moments in history that you can ask people about and they always remember it, depending upon their age group. Where were you when you heard about Pearl Harbor? You know, do you remember where were you when Kennedy was shot? 9/11. You know, these things, these are moments, and that might be helpful if someone is less likely to talk about themselves. They're a little reluctant to get really personal. You can talk to them about historical events, and that might lead them into talking more about themselves. Or they might want to talk about their ancestors. They can talk about their own parents rather than themselves, but that might lead them to their relationship with their parents. And that's when you get more into the personal stuff. So these again these are another kind of prompt, really, which are just categories. Who are the important people to you? And you can make a list of them and then just write about any of them. What were some important activities to you, lessons learned? And this is something, again, I really recommend if you're writing or you're helping someone else to write, is to encourage them or yourself to write about the challenging stuff and not just the victories. Yeah. Did someone have a question? Okay. The truth is powerful. Speaking your truth is the most powerful tool we all have, says Oprah. Oh, I mentioned about the 16th portrait. You can do that, and I have done that for people because that's what they wanted. It's more like an autobiography without the memoir elements, which is just all their achievements and what led from one thing to another. And if you have good story elements, it could still be a great story. You know, if you talk about, if there's still sensory detail and all those things. I'll talk about narrative elements, what I mean by that, more in detail in a moment. But you know, if you're getting into the emotional truths, I think that's when you really connect with people more. Treasure the struggles in your past to discover the meaning within those experiences, to capture the unique myth at work in your own life. We all tell our own stories, and sometimes we have to ask, are those stories still true? And you can't determine what stories you write will matter for generations from now. So if you're writing with grandchildren in mind, or great-grandchildren or future generations, you never know what will grab them and what they'll connect to and what might help them think about their own identities. But universal truths will do that. When you are truthful, when you have something that's really true for you, it tends to happen. Oh, somebody had mentioned this. We were talking about, you know, creative nonfiction versus memoir and autobiography, and you know, and of course this is a big thing in the media, right? It's like, oh my God, she said it was a memoir and they made this part up. I always include a disclaimer in the books that I publish for people. Something like this, it could be a little different, but that these are a matter of personal opinion. It reflects the opinions, perceptions, and memories of the author, and are of a personal opinion, not necessarily fact, are in no way intended to be hurtful to any individual or group. So, you know, right off the bat, this book is, again, emotional memories. It's one person's memory. And so someone else could disagree. Oh my gosh, one of the first books I ever did was my father-in-law. Such a sweetheart. I love him. But there was a story he told, and I was telling it to my husband, his son, and my son said, that didn't happen to my sister, that happened to me. And so I rewrote it. And then in the revision, and my father-in-law's like, no, this happened this way. And I was like, okay, wow, you know, you're right. Your memory is correct for this book. So I think that's a really important distinction as well. To be Jedi is to face the truth and choose. Okay, there we go. The process for people doing it, I found, can be very therapeutic. It can be tough sometimes, like I said, because you're dealing with sometimes the hard stuff, but it's also really therapeutic. I had one person tell me the other day, it's like, my God, this is like therapy. And I'm like, I'm not a therapist. But yes, there's elements when you're telling your story that are therapeutic. It's good for the brain. It jogs your memory. So so it's really good for you to do this. It's a great exercise. It's a learning experience for the author, not just the reader. So, and I always feel it's completely worth it. I mean, if you create a connection just with one other people, or, you know, your identity, belonging. You make history real for somebody. You leave a legacy. It's worth it. Okay. These are some story elements I was talking about that, again, I wouldn't worry about this in your first draft. This is revision stuff. But this is going to help make it more readable. And that's always one of my goals, is to make these readable, like as if you were, you know, you can't stop reading it. And I use a bunch of different techniques for that too, that I can tell you about that are structural. But this is a story, in terms of story elements, setting and context are really important. So say you're writing your story and it took place in your hometown. It took place in 1955. It's worthwhile maybe to go online and look up your hometown in 1955 and look at some pictures and add what was going on during that time. What was going on in the world during that time? What did your town look like? And the stuff that you remember too. You know, it's a time of drive-ins and saddle shoes and poodle skirts and, you know, and where your main activity was going to dances and doing, you know, with your friends and, or going to get a soda at the local soda shop, you know, whatever. But the context is what's going to give it flavor and meaning. And the setting, describing the setting. So if you're talking about something that happened in your home, it happened in the library, the shelves, a room with the shelves full of books, or, you know, it was a new house. The walls were white. You give it those things, and all of a sudden there's a flavor to your writing. When you study, I studied literature, and you often, when you're doing critical analysis of literature, you're looking for those things because those setting details tell you something about the emotions or the experience of the characters, and they add to it. And you're going to tell the truth about what it was really like in that house. You don't have to make anything up, because I mean, all of us probably have stories in our lives where truth is stranger than fiction. And if we tried to tell some of that story and tell them, they wouldn't believe us, right? You have those kinds of stories. So you don't really have to make up anything to make it more interesting, but you want to incorporate those aspects. There's inciting incidences and turning points and conflict. And so when you're writing your story and when you're revising the story, you can look for those and maybe pull those out of the writing a little bit. And you can do that a little bit in formatting, like starting a new paragraph with, and then, you know, and then I fell. Boom. And then you start a new paragraph, you know, things like that can make a huge difference. Sensory details are huge. When you're going back to revise, are you incorporating every once in a while what you can see, touch, smell, hear, and taste? As we know, these kinds of things are all memory, you know, our memory triggers as well. So they can mean, and then there's themes, like, again, just write. There's a reason why that story means something to you. You don't have to think about it while you're writing it, but when you go back and look at it, what is it about? That's when you can add deeper reflection. See if you can go beyond that. What does it mean to you now, looking back? What was that all about? What did you learn from it? You know, what was that like for that little boy or that little girl at that time? You know, and then what is that like for you now as you look back on that and think about that little boy or that little girl? Okay.
If I can,
Yeah.
oh, sorry, if I can step in for just a quick second.
Please.
I know that we had a question earlier. Someone had written a bunch of disparate essays from their life, different moments and things. Do you have recommendations for ways to tie that into a cohesive whole?
Ooh, yeah. Yeah, let's see. There's different ways to do it. Structurally, you can do it where you don't try to connect them. You don't try to connect them if they don't connect. And that would be a structural way to do it. Think about how a short story collection is put together. And maybe follow that as a guide. And so then it would be all about the table of contents and having these titles. if they did happen during different parts of the life, maybe they are chronological. You could look at all the stories and see if there is a theme. And just by giving the book a title that sort of maybe suggests that theme or an introduction is another way to do it. If there is something that you see as an element throughout. Another way might be just to have an introduction that mentions that we all have, these memories, these vignettes in our life that stand out, and you put them together, and that makes the person, and so these are the moments, the most important moments, or the outstanding moments in this one particular life. So one of the solutions may be to not try to artificially connect them if they don't connect, but to do so just structurally. So those are some of the ways I can think. Put it in chronological order, give it a theme, or just make it like a short story collection. And I'm open to other suggestions, but those are the things, those are ways that I've worked on it. And another thing, I was talking about how you keep people's attention. Sometimes you'll have little tiny anecdotes or parts of a longer piece too, if you have a phase of life. And one of the things that I will sometimes do is have a chapter starter, and then within that chapter, I have section headings, and I'll try to come up with something real jazzy for the section heading that gets your attention. And so the story is continuing, but it's kind of a new section, because sometimes in these types of books, in a personal history book anyway, people might read through it once, but they're going to keep it on their shelf or on their coffee table, and maybe they'll pick it up again. And if they see an interesting title, they keep reading it, because we're very title-oriented people. We see headlines. And then also if you incorporate pictures, because nowadays, thank God, we have that digital printing that I talked about with the rise of the memoir. We have digital publishing. So you can put pictures on every page or any page. It used to have to be with offset printing that we'd had to have. You've probably seen them in older books, right? The 16-page insert of images. It had to happen on those 16 pages or 8, and that was it. It had to be on 16. It was the only number you could have, 8 or 16. But now you can also have a picture that makes you look at the story and then read the story, and then you look at the headline, and that keeps you reading. So that's another way, just to keep people reading and maybe connect the stories too, depending on how they're written. I don't know, is anybody interested in genealogy? I might skip this section just to say that, I'm on Ancestry.com all the time, and newspapers.com all the time. One of the things I would suggest doing if you're interested in genealogy is definitely include story elements of characters as best you can. You can read between the lines. If you look at a census in 1920 and 1925, and all of a sudden someone's living somewhere else, there's a story. And by mentioning it, you can, even if you don't know exactly what happened, there's a story. But there's a married couple and they're no longer living together. This is ways to incorporate it in genealogy if you want to. Okay. So when you're doing revision, and we're going to talk about publishing because I want to get back to that. Someone asked where you can, I think also, right? Did somebody ask like where else can you share stories? So I want to get to that, and I don't want to be too long. But in revision, these are some things in revision to look for: is clarity, accuracy, deeper reflection, removing redundancies, adding your story elements. I really like active voice, not too passive. I'm working with a wonderful fellow now who was a lifetime lawyer, and he's just stories amazing. But I'm constantly trying to. He wrote it, and then I helped him revise it. And I'm just like, can we make that an active sentence, please? Because he likes passive. A lot of law writing tends to be in passive voice. You can always hire a developmental editor if it's overwhelming to do it. Or a developmental editor versus a copy editor is different. Developmental editing is someone will go through and they'll ask you questions about things to help you clarify or add depth, whereas copy editing is correctness, making sure sentences are different lengths, just better writing, crafting the writing. I keep my thesaurus.com. Oh, I have another typo, but I keep it up all the time on my computer. I love my thesaurus. That helps because you might find repetitive words, the same word that you use a lot, and so you could look for a good different word, same meaning. Revision is not going back and fussing around, but going forward into the process of creation is a way to look at it. If you can't get it into book form, I just mentioned it briefly, I've done some books that are just in interview form. You interview someone, you don't worry too much about correctness, but you get it in there. Anything to get it down on paper. Sometimes maybe add some pictures, or you get rid of your voice as the interviewer, but keep it simple. Oh, and this is, again, story structure can be found in every pattern of our lives. It's just up to us to uncover it. So, and again, so you can decide on your organization. When in doubt, keep it simple. Again, this is in revision. You don't worry about organizing it at first, but you can go chronologically. You can do it by phases of life. You could also, that's another way, the vignettes, you can look and see if there's any of them that have similar experiences, or maybe there's a few of them that have a theme, and then another few that have a theme. And I just organized a book like that, where we organized it, just a bunch of different vignettes, but one had to do with like moving to a new country and finding her own place. Another one had to do with after the death of her husband, so it was about carrying on. And so they were unrelated stories, but they all fit within that one category. So we had part 1, part 2, part 3, and part 4 of the book. Oh, somebody asked what not to include ethically. So, and this is one thing to not include. You don't want to talk negatively about living people in your book, judgments about living people, or telling other people's stories. I mean, if you want to do that, you can, but I don't recommend it. And what I mean by telling other people's stories is different. If you're going to tell your story about being with that person and what you thought and what you did and how you reacted, but you can't assume you know their story. So you wouldn't say, he felt this or he did this. You would say, I saw him do this, and this is how I reacted. You have to tell your story. Again, with my father-in-law's book was my first book, right? And he did say something about his sister-in-law who had married when she was very young. And, and there was a way that he put it that really offended her current husband. And so we went back and revised that. So I had to learn too. But you want to keep going. These are different ways to keep going.
Sorry, Linda, I apologize for interrupting.
That's okay, please do.
I just wanted to give a quick time check. It's 8:50 now, and I know we wanted to, I know time flies. I know we wanted to wrap up close to 9 o'clock. You did mention also the genealogy, and we did have someone who was really excited to hear a little bit more about incorporating the genealogy into this.
Okay.
So I know it's hard to fit in everything you want to.
I'm sorry. I have so much content. Let me, I'm going to turn off I'll show you the rest of the slides just so you can see what else I was going to cover. I'm just going to go boom, 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 not talk about them. And that way, then I'm going to turn it off so I can answer questions. And then you guys will all get this slide later. So this part is about actually how to create books and resources for that, about your photos and images, different options for creating your own books, a couple things to consider, getting an ISBN and registering with Library of Congress. Anybody can do it. And so let me turn off this. Oh yeah, and then if you're not books, you can do videos, podcasts. There's so many possibilities out there, and there's services to do those, believe it or not. So anyway, so let me now. Okay, so what was a question about genealogy?
I think they were you had mentioned it and just asked if there was excitement around including genealogy into these stories, and then what would be the best ways to incorporate that?
Yeah, yeah. It again, I have to say, I start with saying it really depends on you and your interest. Like I do have a gal I'm working with who wants it. Oh my God, I was overwhelmed. She wanted it in like the genealogy registry form, which is a very specific form. And there's all different kinds. She wanted in the New England registry form. So I actually got a contractor to work with me to help create that. But then along with that, the part that I'm really developing for her is taking the stories that she has of her ancestors, the Greenwoods, that goes all the way back to England, and helping her to make those into a narrative story. I think, yes, there's a lot of interest in genealogy. We all want to know, we want to feel like we're part of something. We belong to a family because it's a sense of belonging and identity and pride when you find out, what people have done before you and who you're related to. Um, so um, I think it's so ways to include it might be just, you could just go a couple generations back with your own memories, your parents, your grandparents, um, and the famous stories in your family. And maybe fact check some of that stuff, add context, add historical context about what they lived through. You could do more research on ancestry.com or similar sites. Or if you have that information already, again, you want to kind of, you could read between the lines or look for stuff in newspapers. In local newspapers used to have all kinds of stuff just about people in that neighborhood, and so you could find something there. Um, but yeah, I mean, trying to write it out as a little story is very helpful when it comes to genealogy. Um, yeah, it's fantastic. But even if you just have a list of dates and names and say this is where we came from, like, you know, that's really interesting itself. But then where you came from, what was that like? So, if you came from uh, if you came from someplace in Scotland, what was it like at that time, and what was the tartan, and what was your flag, and how does that, how did the people leave, that story of where they immigrated to, and why? Um, yeah, I think that's so great um, to include. Okay, I saw somebody had included Rhyme Zone. I use Rhyme Zone. I love Rhyme Zone. That's great, as well as Thesaurus. What else have I not? Oh yeah, the '89 earthquake. That's a really great one. Yes. If for Bay Area folks. I'm looking back through chat now to make sure I've answered any more. And Darren, if you see something, please let me know.
I've tried to do a
Soundtrack.
good job of flagging things for you. I
Thank
mean,
you.
hopefully I didn't miss anything. If anyone feels that I did, please let me know as well.
I'm seeing some great additions too. Soundtrap. That's I've never heard of. That is wonderful. Oh, look at this, a great article. Oh, I'm going to read it. Thank you. Um, Oh, someone uses Google Dictate for authentic voice. Yes, that's awesome. Um, we went over the ethical considerations. Um, okay, how do you share them widely? After you write a family history short story, how do you share them widely? That's the only one I think. So um, it's not a simple answer because you can do it in so many different ways. Um, uh, I mean, one, of course, is social media. Is using your social media outlet and putting them on Facebook. That's easy. Something you can control is put them on your social media outlet. Um, there are publications specifically for that as well that you could look up. I mean, you could even Google it. Maybe something to do with retirement. What's it called? The retirement. Oh, I just forgot the name of the organization for retired people.
AARP.
Thank you, AARP. I remember when I got my card. Yeah, so you get your card in the mail before you actually reach the age. It's always disturbing. Um, so there's there's that. There's publications that specialize in that. Local newspapers will still take a lot of personal essays, and so you can look at that as an option. There's some amazing websites out there now that are shared story sites. where people share their fiction and nonfiction. And there's some amazing ones out there that are different than, say, a literary magazine. And so that's another place to do it. Gosh, yeah, I hope that answers that question. There's also, if you're putting them into book form, since I didn't talk about how to put them in book form, I use a site a lot called lulu.com. And there's also, of course, Amazon.com has its own publishing site for self-publishers, independent publishers. And so if you're putting it into book form, you can put it on Amazon. Even a very, very short story, a very, very short piece, and you can make it an ebook as well as a regular book. And lulu.com is also where you can put it there, and you can share the URL with people, and they can go in and buy it. And you can share it publicly so everybody can buy it, or just with people you know. And how to convince others to submit stories to, gosh, I think it's that shitty first draft mentality. It's just get it out there. If you have something that's meaningful to you, chances are it's meaningful to somebody else. Is there anything else? After all, we have, yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Anything I can answer for you, or do you want to talk about?
Oh, I know we're running out of time, but I wondered if you could talk about your service.
Oh, what I do. Yeah. So it's kind of all of the above. Like I said, it's very customized. So I will do everything from work with someone who is doing their own writing and be their developmental editor, copy editor, and publisher, meaning that I can help them get it into story form, and into a polished form, and then into a book, and then also get the book published for either the public or for family and friends. And I also will help people who, like I said, they don't even know where to start to write. And so I will do personal interviews and then transcribe those and turn those into stories that then they review and make sure are accurate and that they like them. And then I also will scan pictures and help them organize photos and incorporate that. So I do book design as well, and layout. So yeah, I kind of do all the parts, and so for some people I'll do just one part, and for others I'll do all of the above. So I'm kind of yeah. And it's really exciting to help people. So I hope that answers your question. So yeah, and I'm blogging on I have given myself, this is something you could try. I was not sharing my work. I mean, I have books out there, but I wasn't sharing the stuff that was really meaningful and personal to me. And I needed to start doing that. So I have a secondary website called lindaparkerhamilton.com. And I started, I was blogging a little bit, and finally I found a 100-day project, which was created by an art professor, and I won't keep you, I'll do this really quickly. Art professor, challenging his students, and it was kind of like to combine the freedom that you need as an artist to create with the discipline it takes to get it out there in the world. And so I've given myself a 100-day challenge, and I have to write something every day and share it. And I can write anything I want in any form I want. And I give myself 15 minutes with 5 minutes to edit and 5 minutes to get it up with some sort of a visual. And oftentimes I take longer, but because it's my rules. But the rules that are steadfast is every day, and I have to share it. So I have the 100-day challenge. So I don't have there's a link to that on my website that I'll give to Darren to share with you guys about what the 100-day project, it's where it came from. But that's something you could try too. I want to thank you all so much for being here, and I hope I've provided some interesting information as well as some helpful information. And you're welcome to reach out to me if you have a question anytime by email.
Linda's very accessible via her website. That I think is how I found her originally when we had talked about some of her hiking books. Actually, she's written some excellent hiking books and a home camping activity guidebook for families too. So very disparate, very different from what we talked about today. Thank you all so much for coming. I think, Linda, one thing I really got from you today was this idea of, and especially with reticent family members and drawing them out, just this creating that consistency for them. I like that idea of one prompt a week, something they can kind of expect and count on and then respond back to and work with. We really would appreciate if you all took the time to read this event. I dropped a link in the chat. I'll also include one in the email that I send out to you later that will include some of the slideshows, as many of the resources as I can pull from the chat, which should not be difficult because it does all get saved, and a link to a recording from tonight. So thank you all so much for being a part of this. It's nice to be a part of your community and for you to invite us into your homes the way that you let us invite you into ours. So thank you.
Thank you again.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.